He's Paul Hudrick, our Sixers insider over at 97.3 ESPN.com. He has a Sixers trade primer live in real time on the website. You can check out all the details, all the names that are being thrown out there, from the big names to the no names. Because apparently, Paul, Will Barton is a no name, according to some people on social media. Larry Nance Jr. is a no name, according to some people. And I want to start there. I feel like people forget that, you don't win just with superstars. Ray Allen had to hit a three for the Heat for them to win. Remember, people have to hit other shots for teams. Jordan did pass the ball to Kerr and to Paxson. So people forget that if you don't have a good supporting cast, what's the point of having a superstar?
Well, and the reality is they have two superstars already, which is better than what a lot of other teams have. The Lakers only have two superstars, and it worked out pretty well for them last year. The Miami Heat have one, and they went pretty far last year as well. So it's about surrounding those guys with the right type of player. To call Will Barton a no-name, to me, that shows you don't watch basketball. Right. I get it. The Denver Nuggets, you don't see them a lot because they're, playing in Denver. But Will Barton is a good basketball player. Not only is he a good basketball player, he fits exactly what the Sixers need. He can score the basketball. He wants to shoot the basketball, which I question sometimes whether some of these surrounding the supporting cast wants to shoot the ball. Will Barton has no trouble. He wants to shoot the basketball. He wants to score. And it's funny, Josh, because I look at it like this. The way I've been describing Will Barton is as a taller and younger Lou Williams. Now, if I told Sixers fans that they were getting Lou Williams, you would be excited. I say Will Barton doesn't do much for you, but realistically, it's a lot of the same skill set. Again, just a taller and younger player. So to call a guy like a Will Barton or even a Larry Nance, they're not no names. These guys can play. They can play ball, and they're upgrades over what some of the Sixers have in some other spots. So, yeah, they're not superstars, but they're damn good basketball players.
Now, that being said, no matter who they add, because we all assume they're going to add somebody, right, Paul? I think let's start there. It's fair to assume that Daryl Morey is not going to sit on his hands before the trade line. This guy does not have a history of being a guy who just sits on his hands.
100%. When you look at what he did in Houston, he was always looking for ways. When he was there, it was all about how do I build this best around James Harden. He's been up front since he's gotten here. It's how do I build this best around Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. Now he's kind of thrown since Tobias Harris has played so well, kind of throw his name in that ring of those three guys. How do I build the rest? How do I build best around those three players? So yeah, I absolutely expect Daryl Morey, whether it's swinging big for a Kyle Lowry or a Victor Oladipo, or whether it's just shoring up that bench. Because look at the Sixers starting five; they've been one of the best 5-man units in the NBA this season. So to me, the bigger issue is that bench. You need to upgrade that bench so that when some of the better players come out, the players you're inserting you're not having that big dramatic drop off. So the Sixers are the best team in the Eastern Conference right now by their record, and their starting lineup has been one of the best in the league. So really, realistically, if you add to the bench and make the bench better, and make the depth better, then you can play with anybody. I really do truly strongly believe that. Now, if there's an opportunity to get a Kyle Lowry, absolutely you need to explore it and maybe do it if the offer is right. But I don't think that is a make or break thing for them. I think if they do have the opportunity to get Lowry, that's great, but they can still really improve this basketball team without doing that.
Now, you have 10 names on your primer over at 97.3 ESPN.com. I want to give them all away, but people actually go and read it because you have a lot of great details in there. If I had to tell you, Paul, you could only get one of those 10 names. If the Sixers walked away with only one of those 10 guys, and you are the person who could pick one, who would it be and why?
Well, Lowry would be the obvious one, just because he just ticks so many boxes for them as an extra ball handler, an extra shot creator, which they sorely need. He's not afraid to take big shots. He makes big shots. His toughness, the championship. We all know what Kyle Lowry is all about. The dude just wants to win. He has that bulldog mentality. He's 6 feet tall, but he plays a hell of a lot bigger than 6 foot tall. And so that, to me, he's the guy that would just make the most sense because I think he would just elevate them to another level. And then I think about the idea, if we're just talking about that matchup against the Nets, if they bring in a Kyle Lowry, then maybe you put Matisse Thybulle in the starting five instead of Seth Curry, then you're matching up right off the bat. Kyrie has to deal with Kyle Lowry. James Harden has to deal with Matisse, and Durant has to deal with Ben Simmons. I'm not saying they're going to shut them down or anything, but if you look around the league, that gives the Sixers as good of a shot of anybody to match up against the Nets than I would say any other team in the NBA. So Lowry, from a two-way standpoint, I think would just elevate them to such a level, and to me would make them and the Nets would be neck and neck at that point for me as far as favorites to come out of the East if they were to get Kyle Lowry.
Paul Hudrick joining us here for Inside the Sixers here on 97.3 ESPN, at Paul Hudrick on Twitter. Of course, the Sixers NBA trade primer right now at 97.3ESPN.com and on 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Now, you mentioned the Nets. This is my question for the day, and I'm really curious what you think about this. What is the gap between the Nets and the other teams? Because I feel like I get it. Durant, Harden, Irving. But it's like after those three, there's a huge drop-off. You know, I mentioned earlier, you need a supporting cast to be successful. And part of me wonders, man, if one of those guys goes down at the 7-game series, are the Nets beating a really good team if that team is at least close to them? So what is the realistic gap between the Nets and the Sixers, or the Nets and the other top teams in the Eastern Conference?
I don't think it's that dramatic. I mean, don't get me wrong. Right now, I think it's fair to say that the Nets are the favorite in the East. I don't think that's out of line to say. But to think that there is this significant gap between them and even the Milwaukee Bucks, who I think people are kind of forgetting about. I mean, I get it. They haven't had as good of a start as maybe some would have hoped, but they also were missing Drew Holiday, their big offseason acquisition. They were missing him for a pretty good chunk there. So they're a team that's going to get better, and they're going to look to improve too. They're not going to sit by and watch the Nets and the Sixers just overtake them. They're going to look to be aggressive and add pieces around the margins as well. So I think that's the other factor too, Josh. It's as we sit here today, yes, I do. If I had to pick a favorite, I would say the Nets are the favorite, but that's just as we sit here today. And I don't think the Sixers are going to look the same. I don't think the Bucks are going to look the same. And quite frankly, I don't think the Heat or the Celtics are going to look the same. All of these teams are going to look different. And in the second half of the season, I think is going to be so compelling in Eastern Conference because I don't think there is this significant gap between all of these teams. I sort of think the East is kind of up for grabs, and it's going to be these little moves on the margins and upgrading these benches and getting these certain players that's going to elevate one team or the other. So I am really fascinated to see, but I don't think the Nets are like this runaway clear favorite. I think they have their work cut out for them to compete against the other teams in the East.
I want to get back to what you said about Thybulle earlier. I think it's a very fascinating concept of putting Thybulle in the starting lineup if you get Lowry, because it kind of, and it's not the same. I'm not saying he is this guy, but there's a part of me that remembers Brooks Bowen with the Spurs, a guy who's literally only out there for defense and spot up shooting, right? And Thybulle, he's more athletic than Bowen was. He's a guy who, listen, he can go out there, he can get a dunk for you on his fast break. I feel like that he can kind of play that role where it's like, hey, Matisse, we're not asking you to be a scorer. We're literally asking you to just look at that guy and say, bring it.
Yeah, I mean, when you look, so in that theoretical scenario where they get a Lowry, I mean, you get scoring from four different guys who are capable of giving you, 20 to 30 on a given night. And Ben Simmons and Lowry are both excellent passers. They could give you double-digit assists on any given night. So to have those four guys, you don't need all five guys to score. So you can put them at Matisse Thybulle in the starting lineup. And then not only that strengthens because then you're coming out with Shake Milton and Seth Curry in your second unit, and that makes the bench stronger. So I think there's certainly room for that. You use the Bruce Bowen comparison, a guy like Andre Robertson, what he did for the Thunder when they went to the finals. I mean, there are plenty of examples of guys who that was their job. When you look at what Tony Allen did even with Memphis during those years when they had Connolly and Gasol and Randolph and those guys, Tony Allen was not a good offensive player, but he was just so good defensively that they had to find a spot for him. So, yeah, I absolutely think if you're that loaded with your other four players offensively, you could absolutely insert a guy like Matisse Thybulle, and he could play a huge role.
Paul, we got a question over here on the text board. I'll pop it up on the screen for everybody watching on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Dan EHT says, the question I have at the Sixers is if they get to a conference final, but they get thumped by the Nets, what does the offseason look like? And that's an interesting question because there's a variety of reasons Do you get thumped because you just were outplayed? Do you get out thumped because maybe Simmons or Embiid or Harris are injured? Like, I feel like there's a lot of variations there, but it is an interesting thing to think about if the Sixers get to the conference final, which is farther than they've ever been with this group, right? They haven't been to the conference finals, but if they get there, and maybe it's like Jordan's Bulls and they could just get punched in the face like the Pistons back in the day, what does the Sixers offseason look like?
Yeah, I think that's the big thing, Josh, is you can't overreact or panic because you have Kevin Durant, James Harden are both guys in their 30s. So, of course, like the Nets are going to be like maybe a little bit further along, like from a maturation standpoint, from an experience standpoint, because they have guys who through that and who are, I don't want to say on their last legs, but they're not in the same place that Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons or even a Tobias Harris are. Those guys are all under 30 and are just kind of scratching the surface of their primes. Harden and Durant, as great as they are right now, they're not in their primes right now. So I don't think if you're the Sixers, you're Daryl Morey, you can't overreact if that happens. And like you said, Josh, there are facts. It's going to matter how it happens. It's not necessarily, the if, it's the how and why it happens. So like if Ben Simmons continues to, struggle in the playoffs and the Nets have a good strategy for him, that makes you maybe reevaluate some things there. Not saying you move Ben Simmons, but just reevaluate how you build the roster around him. If Tobias Harris struggles, do you, maybe try to look into getting out of that contract? If you get a Kyle Lowry and that doesn't work out, maybe you don't re-sign Kyle Lowry at that point. Maybe you let him walk and look to make tweaks. I just think you don't overreact because Joel Embiid is 26 years old. Ben Simmons is 24 years old. So I just think from that standpoint, you just want to put it all in perspective, come back in the offseason and just assess it, take a deep breath, assess it, see what happened and why you lost. And I'm sure Daryl Morey will absolutely have that approach.
Paul Hudrick joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. Josh Hennig filling in for Mike Gill on a Hump Day Wednesday. Speaking of overreaction, I'm seeing an overreaction in the other direction as well. You kind of point to a little bit there on your tweet there about the Delaware Bluecoats. Paul Reed. There's a bunch of people now out there being like, you got to call up Paul Reed. Paul Reed's the answer for the stretch four. What is Paul Reed at this point? Because I know he's played really well. I've only seen one game personally, but I feel like everyone and their mother is like raving about him at this point and how he's played in Delaware. Do you think he can be a contributor for the Sixers down the stretch?
Well, I want to preface this, Josh, by saying if you read my work for my previous employer, I was all over Paul Reed as a prospect. The night of the draft, I probably tweeted 3 different times about that I think the Sixers need to draft Paul Reed. So you will not find a guy who was bigger on Paul Reed coming out of DePaul. I love this game. I love the athleticism. I love the skill, the touch, the little things he can do. With that said, he is 21 years old. He is a rookie. All the credit in the world because he went down there and he's dominant. He probably should be the league's MVP. They're going to play in the title game on Thursday. The guy deserves all the credit in the world for what he's done down there. With that said, you are trying to win a championship. So could he help you? Maybe he might, but you can't rely on that. You can't say, okay, yeah, Paul Reed, go in there and be my stretch 5 or my stretch 4 and help us win a title. That's just not a realistic expectation. It's not impossible. It could happen. Rookies help. It happens from time to time, but you can't go into this second half of the season expecting that to happen. He'll get a look, I'm sure, here and there. Listen, Joel Embiid will probably miss a game or two. Does Doc Rivers maybe look at him as as the backup 5 on certain nights when Dwight Howard, is the starter? Maybe in certain situations, maybe Doc will use him. But the NBA experience is what's going to be important. Not to kind of throw cold water on all the fans who are really excited about how good he looks, because he does look good. But the G League and the NBA are 2 different worlds. And with all that said, going forward, I absolutely love the idea of Paul Reed, perhaps next year, as early as next year. Dwight Howard's contract is done at the end of the year. Perhaps Paul Reed next year slips into that backup 5 role, and he could do a lot of things, man. I mean, you've seen the shot is really coming along. He shot the 3 ball extremely well. He can screen, he can roll, he can finish. He can go rim to rim, block shots. He's got great hands. He's switchable. He can do a lot of things. He really fits the mold of the modern NBA big. So if he does not help them this year, he absolutely will have a chance to help them down the road.
Now, you mentioned Joel Embiid, Sixers without him. It looks like we would probably be without Embiid and Simmons at least Thursday, Friday. At least that's the working assumption, as long as everything goes fine. What is fair to expect of this team coming out of the break? Because if Simmons and Embiid aren't there for at least 1 or 2 games, that impacts that. Obviously, they've got to get back into it. They haven't probably played any basketball for over a week. And it's an interesting stretch to say the least. I mean, you got the Bulls, the Wizards, the Spurs, the Knicks, who are technically right now a playoff team, the Bucks, and of course you have the Kings, who can't guard anybody. So you have a very interesting mix of teams to come out of this break with.
Yeah, I know that the Bulls and the Wizards, they're not, quite frankly, they're just not very good teams, but they are still right in the thick of things in the Eastern Conference to possibly get a playoff spot. So they're hungry. They want to win. And not only that, both teams have 2 extraordinarily dangerous players in Zach LaVine and Bradley Beal. So you can't sleep on those guys in a given night. So not having Ben Simmons for both of those games against those players, and great, Matisse Thybulle has actually done an excellent job on Zach LaVine in their matchups and what we've seen. But that's a big ask, especially the first game without Joel Embiid. Listen, it's the NBA and it's a long season. If you're missing your 2 best players, you're probably susceptible to lose games because the talent gap, it can be so significant, and it's such a star-driven league. So I am worried about both of those first 2 games, more so the first one because without either guy. The second one I'm a little worried because I have Bradley Beal without Ben Simmons on the floor to guard him, so that makes me worry. So, but I would say for Sixers fans is don't freak out. It's 2 games. It could have been worse. Both guys continue to test negative. That is a positive. So just, weather the storm for these 2 games. You should be back at strength Sunday, the first game with fans at the Wells Fargo Center. So, don't overreact to these next 2 games. It's going to be a little rocky, but got a long stretch for the second half of the season. Trade deadline's coming up. So just keep that in perspective for those 2 games.
You brought up the fans at the Wells Fargo Center. I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot even about that. What is that going to be like? Because, listen, we saw the Flyers, their first game back there. The fans literally carried their tired legs for a period and a half. I was at the Boardwalk Hall last night for the MAC tournament that went to overtime. And they had basically they maybe 100 people there. And when that guy hit that buzzer beater to go to overtime, it felt like there was 1,000 some fans in there. You know what I mean? So what is it going to be like for the Sixers, who were an amazing home team, right? They were this dominant force of nature at home, and they've been playing without fans. And now all of a sudden, there's going to be 1 or 2,000 in the building, right?
I believe it's like 3,000 that are going to be there. So yeah, you mentioned the Flyers, and you can hear the difference. I can hear just watching Flyers games on my TV. I can hear the difference when from when it was the fake crowd noise to when it's the real crowd noise. You can tell the difference, and especially with the boos, you can definitely tell with the boos. But there have been so many moments where I think about it like, if the fans were in the seats, what would this have been like? One of them is that Tyrese Maxey game where he puts up 39 points. I think the fans would have loved that effort. I know it was a terrible situation with the Sixers, with all the health and safety protocols, but just the fact that Maxey went off that day, I think fans would have just loved to have been there and experienced that. I'm sure they would have gone nuts. I think about even the game before the break against the Jazz. Oh, the crowd would have been going crazy. Dwight Howard hits that 3. I'm sure people would have been going nuts. And Joel Embiid hits that 3, as the buzzer's about to go off. So I'm these little moments I think about and how much it would be enhanced by the crowd being there and how much louder it would be. So I'm sure that energy, you're going to feel it on the TV. I'm sure I'm going to feel it when I'm in the arena going to games. So it'll be cool to see. And like I said, with the Flyers games, you can certainly feel it. And I expect the Sixers fans to bring it the same way.
He is Paul Hudrick, our Sixers insider for 97.3 ESPN.com. Follow him on Twitter at Paul Hudrick. Check out his latest NBA trade primer. All the details. He's got 10 names on there you want to check out. Also information on the trade exceptions, players who might be traded, and more. It's all in there in one article on 97.3 ESPN.com and the 97.3 ESPN mobile. And don't forget the podcast coming in for a landing, and as all guests, he appeared on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Paul, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
I think we did, Josh. It's good stuff, man.